Welcome back. Happy 2024. I hope that this holiday season has been very kind to you and that you are very happy to reign in the new year. I am personally a big fan of the new year rolling around, mainly so I can set and try to accomplish several different resolutions that I make. One that I commonly try to set is trying to read every single day. And over time, I have failed and absolutely gotten worse, but I'm very hopeful that this year is different. Another key resolution of mine in the past has been to make more videos. I haven't made a big deal about it, but I have been posting weekly Minecraft content. These are just short-form videos of progress in my world, which I'm continuing to make. But I really want to get back into making political content on top of this. My last video was made in late 2021, so I'm definitely overdue for making a new one. And hopefully with this video, it can get me a bit more comfortable with making this kind of content as a whole. So I just want to talk about freedom of speech this time around. Overall, I think it's a really simple topic, despite the wealth of implications that it reaches. And as with other videos, I want to give a background on the topic from a legal and a public perspective. And later, I'll be offering my opinion and my justification for those items and more. There are going to be timestamps in the description in case you want to skip around to different parts of the video. Before I go further into this video, I need to ask, what is the First Amendment? In the U.S. Constitution, it reads, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech or of the press, or the right of the people peacefully to assemble and to petition the government for a redress of grievances. It says plainly that these rights are free to pursue and that the government may not infringe upon them. But, as you might imagine, different interpretations and active practice of these rights have led to numerous legal challenges and restrictions. Instead of focusing on the full breadth of the First Amendment, I will just try to zero in on freedom of speech, as I stated previously. So first off, what is speech? Quite literally, speech is the expression of, or the ability to, express thought and feelings by articulate sounds. But the sense that I want to focus on, speech is defined as a formal address or discourse delivered to an audience. I think it's more important to stay on the second definition. Additionally, it's important to look at the word audience and its possible scope. It can be made to a single friend or to a friend group. It can be made in person or through some messaging app. It can be made to followers on a public or private social media account. It can be made through an interview panel, recipients in a meeting, or attendees that fill an amphitheater. Or it can be made to passersby as you preach in the center of a public park. The point of laying out the possibility of who an audience can be is important in a legal and a personal sense. I find the personal sense to be a bit more interesting, though. Moving from that, I want to get into the legal limitations of speech. Most speech seems to be governed by time, place, and manner restrictions, which have been largely upheld by the Supreme Court over time. Restrictions of this sort must meet 4 criteria: content neutrality, narrowly tailored, serving a significant government interest, and it must leave open ample alternative channels for communication. This makes it so the government is allowed to put sensible restrictions in place, such as the enforcement of noise ordinances or anti-camping regulations. And tied with these types of restrictions have been the invention of free speech zones, as well as government-specific forums on which speech can more or less be controlled. But speech should not be judged generally. There are all sorts of different speech that have different restrictions and interpretations of use. One of the first anti-government speech restrictions in the United States was the Sedition Act of 1798, which would punish anyone that would utter or publish any false, scandalous, or malicious writings against the United States government with the intent to defame or bring them into contempt. This act was used by the Adams administration to punish political opponents, but they were overturned by the Jefferson administration, and thankfully, the individuals targeted by this law were pardoned. Another similar restriction was the Espionage Act of 1917 and the creation of the clear and present danger test for regulating violent speech. Throughout World War I, this test was used to good effect in shutting down challenges to the First Amendment violations, in peaceful distribution of leaflets to resist the draft, argued as having harmed public welfare. But this test was replaced by the imminent lawless action test in 1969, which overturned a lot of those kinds of decisions and is met under 2 conditions. Speech can be prohibited if it is directed at inciting or producing imminent lawless action, and it is likely to incite or produce such action. Moving on, various forms of political speech have been protected throughout the Supreme Court, including anonymous speech and flag burning. Additionally, citizens are also protected from being compelled to make speech by the government. Making false statements and producing obscenity have tests that are similar to the ones I stated previously, coming from the Sullivan and Miller decisions. So, it seems that overall, speech enjoys many protections, and that most restrictions are shut down under strict scrutiny of the courts. Somewhat tangential to this all is the birth of the Section 230 regulation, which helps interactive computer services handle third-party speech online. Since a larger and larger portion of dialogue, debate, and speech is being hosted online, having a foundation for its regulation is going to be important. To keep it brief, Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act of 1996 grants these services protection from the user content that it hosts, as well as the ability to curate such content as it wishes. I think that this regulation expertly aligns the digital world with real life regarding legal speech. Because at the end of the day, you're responsible for your own speech, and people can freely associate or disassociate with you as they freely wish. This is what Section 230 aims to achieve. Unfortunately, numerous attacks and challenges have been launched against the regulation in hopes that it gets taken down. These attacks essentially boil down to unfair treatment of political opinions from social media forums to the lack of enforcement to handle harmful yet legal speech. And as far as I'm aware, the regulation has outlasted some of these challenges, and I hope it can continue to do so in the future. This next section focuses on public opinion on speech, including some of the recent news stories and cultural events that have taken place. But first, let's start with public polling. The Knight Foundation commissioned a study from Ipsos in 2022 that goes over American views on free expression. Overall, it seems that most people find free speech to be important and consider it to be in danger. Partisan groups believe themselves to have less capability to express their speech and that their opponents will have an easier time. Additionally, partisan views infect perceptions on free speech when it comes to hot topic political events, such as the 2020 George Floyd riots and the January 6th riot. On hate speech, most people identify it as a problem on social media, but two trends are identified. Firstly, people support prohibition of more violent hate speech than nonviolent offensive speech. Secondly, people think that different institutions ought to prohibit certain speech, with the government being the least popular, but still substantial, institution to do so. The New York Times published their own survey in 2022, which had interesting questions on perceptions of speech over time. It asked respondents how free they felt to speak on politics, racial relations, and other issues from the past 10 years to today. For politics, nearly half of all people said that they felt less free to comment on, but only a third felt the same for race relations. Overall, the same sentiment about the importance of protecting speech and the capability of individuals to express their own speech is present throughout, as from the prior survey. And while this is highly dated, the Cato Institute published a study in 2017 that goes into similar topics. While people find hate speech morally unacceptable, they did not overwhelmingly support government prohibition of it. Additionally, over 80% of Americans at the time found that hate speech was too hard to ban, just because of its ambiguity. The survey also goes into potential support for certain laws around mandating the use of transgender pronouns, burning the American flag, Holocaust denial, and more. Again, in this report, it details how people feel that they are limited and how that they can express themselves through speech, and many attribute political correctness to it. Despite the obvious sentiment that people support free speech and find it hard to express themselves, there's no shortage of attempts to restrict it further. Republicans have recently been criticized for attempting to ban teaching of certain topics in schools. The widely critiqued Don't Say Gay bill, aka Florida House Bill 1557, passed, aiming to give parents more transparency into their kids' public school education and prohibiting classroom instruction on sexual orientation and gender identity through the 3rd grade. Some detractors have pointed out the vagueness of this bill, leaving questions on constitutionality and enforcement. For critical race theory, Republicans have similarly introduced or passed legislation banning it, saying it is in self teaching racism. There was also a recent call by presidential candidate Nikki Haley to rid social media of anonymous speech via ID verification procedures, all in the name of national security.
Social media companies, they have to show America their algorithms. Let us see why they're pushing what they're pushing. The second thing is every person on social media should be verified by their name. That's, first of all, it's a national security threat. When you do that, all of a sudden people have to stand by what they say, and it gets rid of the Russian bots, the Iranian bots, and the Chinese bots. And then you're going to get some civility when people know their name is next to what they say.
Accountability.
But Republicans are not alone in this. Democrats wish to restrict speech as well. New York passed an anti-hate speech law that would require social media companies to be held more accountable for extremist content. As previously, this bill and others like it have been called into question for their constitutionality. Additionally, Democrats in Colorado attempted to compel a cake shop owner who initially refused to bake a cake for a same-sex wedding, which was shut down by the Supreme Court. Even during the pandemic, the U.S. government worked with social media giants to curb misinformation about COVID-19 and the vaccine. Interestingly, these partisan ties often spark interest in pursuing limitations on speech, in line with the surveys that I have mentioned before. And each of these actions has its own excuse for wanting to seek these restrictions. There are definitely more cases that I could go into, but I want to press on. There are a variety of reasons as to why these restrictions are sought, and some of those might cite the legal ledger, but they largely boil down to what should be tolerated and what should not. What kind of speech goes against this moral framework? What kind of speech should be acceptable and which should not? While this doesn't necessarily tie into speech as a whole, I've often heard of a phenomenon called the paradox of tolerance. Karl Popper, who's commonly associated with this phrase, describes it as arising from the seemingly self-contradictory idea that in order to maintain a tolerant society, the society must retain the right to be intolerant of intolerance. And this might take shape in calling certain intolerance as criminal and possibly reprimandable by force. From what I understand, people who subscribe to this idea deem the intolerant as ones who will ultimately seek violence and suppression to dominate others. Additionally, these intolerant people either do not subscribe to the principle of freedom of speech or will twist it to serve its ends. This is despite the fact that the intolerant are afforded this right among everyone else by the sole fact of living within a tolerant society. So, what do we really do about the intolerant? To the extent that the intolerant should be forcibly removed from society, I find that to be wrong. I believe that defusing the bomb would be better than letting it explode away from you, and I think that many people have done this to great effect. Popper himself seems to think similarly, saying that as long as we can counter the intolerant by rational arguments and keep them in check by public opinion, suppression would certainly be most unwise. But he goes on to say that the intolerant may just ignore the appeal to rational argument and persuade their followers to do the same. In such a case, it can call for placing such movements outside of the law and consider incitement to intolerance and persecution as criminal. I'd like to think that that kind of action should be considered an absolute last resort. As stated, the power of rational argument or other means can be incredibly powerful in changing the outlook of the intolerant. The greatest example that I can point to is musician and activist Daryl Dixon, who single-handedly convinced dozens of KKK members to abandon and denounce the organization. While some of the interactions I have seen him talk about have started as simply finding similarities in music, I absolutely believe that appeals to reason have as much power. I think they most strongly come from having a serious relationship with the individual you're trying to turn away from intolerance. If you're trusted enough by someone and appeal to both their reason-making capabilities, I think that you can definitely take them out of that intolerant field. Obviously, that takes time, but it is possible, and I really think it's worth pursuing. I think what I laid out should be a substantive enough background to formulate and flesh out my opinion on things. Now, I can really ask myself this. What do I want? In an ideal situation, I want as much speech as possible. I want people to feel comfortable enough to speak their minds on anything and everything they wish. Thankfully, it appears that the legal consensus is on my side with this. But why is this an ideal, and is it a good ideal? Generally, speech brings about a wealth of positive things. Speaking, in and of itself, initiates and fosters relationships. Speech is the bedrock for bringing confidence, trust, and humor to relationships with family, friends, and others. Additionally, it's the only way in which we can promote and invent new ideas. Political pundits do this all the time with their viewers, and salesmen also do this with their clients and sponsors. And through this, it can lead to new political thoughts or revolutionary new products. But in pursuit of these good things, the possibility exists for people to make poor use of their speech. This can lead to degradation of relationships, whether those be personal or professional, and it can lead to dangerous and destructive ways of thought, such as bigotry, conspiracy theory, historical, denialism, and more. But this is not alone a sufficient argument against speech. If anything, this gives everyone the knowledge of what is going wrong in the hopes that we can readjust towards the good and the right. Obviously, this in turn comes into conflict as many people have differing ideas of what is good and what is not. But Speech is ultimately the means to identify what exactly that is. And I have high hopes that people are able to come to a reasonable conclusion given enough time. Now that I put forward my ideal, I need a way to be able to materialize it. To do so, everyone should have a responsibility towards speech. Firstly, the speaker needs to be aware of the environment in which they deliver their speech. They absolutely have free rein in what they say, but they need to understand that there exists certain reception and consequence when delivering certain speech to certain groups. While they may not want to better the general discourse or appease everyone, which is fine, they should at least consider the impact that it could have on themselves. For instance, you could have someone constantly posting on social media with a distinct political leaning. While they might have some group of friends or people rallying around them, others might feel cold shoulder and might not want to associate with them anymore, and others might feel outwardly combative and hostile towards their posts. And while this person in the moment might be very content in spreading their speech, it could impact their personal relationships and possibly and extremely their professional reputation as well. Again, that might be fine in some instances, but I don't think that's the case across most of where this happens. The audience, as well, has some responsibility regarding the speech they receive. I think in most circumstances, the people who are the audience of the speech are the intended recipients, and they act accordingly and appropriately. But there are other times where this is not the case, where someone outside the intended audience hears some kind of speech that wasn't directed towards them. In such a case, it's very important that the unintended audience is able to properly contextualize the speech, or else it may lead to them taking drastic and accusatory actions. While there are instances in which certain speech goes beyond the bounds of context and may require action, I think that should be held as a last resort. That's why I think muting and blocking someone on social media exists for a good reason. And even in the case where those options are ignored, is it appropriate to completely disparage someone based on one, most likely minor thing that they said? That goes to a general idea of nobody being perfect and that we should probably accept people's flaws rather than constantly pushing them to be exemplary. I made a video back in 2021 talking about my engagement in politics. It basically goes over how I've handled myself over time and any kind of resolutions that I set for myself going forward. I think it was a really good video overall. I like the self-reflection that I did in there, and I think a lot of it is still true. I put a lot of sideline on political content and other content for a while, so it's uncomfortable for me to get back into it, but I feel energized and interested in doing so today. I am a little bit afraid of being able to share what I think on things, but I think it's the nerves of it all rather than the reality of me being a somewhat reasonable and approachable person to talk about these things, and humble. And hopefully I can do so more frequently, and hopefully you can expect more. But that takes us to the end of the video. I really hope that you enjoyed if you watched the whole way through. If you have any kind of comments or questions, feel free to drop them by, and I'll do my best to respond back to you. I want to be very clear that I am very receptive to any kind of feedback and would love to talk about these more and expand my thoughts. As I said towards the beginning of the video, I want to get back into making content. It takes a little bit to be determined and disciplined enough to sit down and actually write scripts for these and then actually sit down and edit it all into a video format. So please be patient if you're looking for more. I don't want to make any promises like I have in the past. I definitely feel a strong internal desire to do more, and hopefully I can commit. That said, see you soon.